The air in the kitchen was thick with the cloying sweetness of budget frosting and a forced, brittle joy. The aroma, usually comforting, was a sickly reminder of the truth I was trying to ignore. My sister, Charlotte, stood at the granite counter, not baking, but directing, her perfectly manicured hand sweeping across pages of swatches and floral arrangements that looked less like a wedding and more like a royal decree. Her engagement ring, a blinding solitaire that cost more than my first card, flashed with every demanding gesture. I leaned against the doorway, nursing a coffee that had long gone cold, my fingers tracing the worn edge of my tuition statement, the document that was, in theory, my shield. For 3 years, that valid 25,000 college fund had been more than money. It was the sum of every late night shift, every skipped vacation, every high distinction grade I'd clawed my way to. It was the absolute guarantee of the future I was building for myself, a final year of engineering, uninterrupted. Honestly, a vineyard in Tuscany is a must, mother. Charlotte sighed, flipping a page with dramatic exasperation. The photos at the local country club would look tragically provincial. My mother, Eleanor, whose energy had been entirely redirected toward accommodating Charlotte's whims since the engagement, patted her hand with an anxious smile. Of course, sweetheart, we'll make it happen. You deserve the very best. That was the running theme, wasn't it? Desert. Charlotte, the golden child, deserved the best, while my deserved future was simply an obstacle to be cleared. The first conversation weeks ago had been a soft, shoo dance of manipulation. My father, Richard, had cornered me in the garage, his voice low and conspiratorial. Look, we're a little short. The venue costs went up. Charlotte's heart is set on this. He'd laid a heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture that always meant a favor was about to be extorted. If you could just lend us your fund for a few months, we'll pay you back. Promise. Lend. The word tasted like dust. They knew I had no other reserve. They knew my tuition was due in 6 weeks, but they spoke with the authority of people who expected obedience, not negotiation. Dad, I'd begun holding up the statement. This isn't a savings account. It's the final year. If I miss this deadline, I lose the scholarship guarantee. I have to pay this or I'm out. His face had hardened for a brief, unsettling second. Nonsense. Your mother is getting a bonus. We'll have it back to you with interest before the registrar even notices it. You're our son daughter. We take care of you. We would never jeopardize your education. Just help your sister out, okay? Family first. The phrase family first was the emotional chokehold they'd used since childhood, a weapon against my independence. I wanted to refuse, but the thought of the ensuing emotional fallout, the endless silence and judgment, was suffocating. I reluctantly signed the transfer papers, a knot of dread tightening in my gut. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself they were my parents. They wouldn't lie about this. Now, 6 weeks later, the air was still heavy with frosting and empty assurances, and the date for my tuition was less than a week away. I cleared my throat, forcing the polite, neutral tone of a business transaction. Mom, Dad, can we talk for a minute about the fund? The tuition deadline is next Thursday, and I need to make the transfer. The easy silence in the kitchen shattered. Charlotte huffed dramatically, crossing her arms. Can you not, my name? We're choosing our cake centerpiece. It's important. My father put down his coffee cup with a decisive clack that was meant to command immediate silence. My namey, not now. We're busy. It has to be now, I insisted, pushing the tuition statement onto the counter. I need the AO 25,000 back by Monday to ensure the transfer processes. Where are we with the bonus? My mother's face went pale, her eyes darting between my father and Charlotte. It was a reaction that immediately told me everything I needed to know, but wasn't ready to believe. My father ran a hand over his thinning hair, avoiding my gaze. Well, about the bonus. Eleanor's company had some issues. It's been delayed. A few months, maybe. A few months. I stared at him, my voice rising. Dad, a few months means I've lost the semester. You promised I'd have the money back before the deadline. We did our best, Eleanor interjected, the anxious smile replaced by brittle defensiveness. But you know Charlotte's needs are immediate. We can't just tell the caterer no, can we? But you can tell me no to my career. I felt the first wave of true heat, the dizzying realization that they were choosing a wedding reception over my future. Charlotte, sensing the spotlight was no longer on her 10,000 floral budget, finally chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. Oh, don't be so dramatic, my namey. It's just a year off, you can work and save again. It's not a big deal. The wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event. It's not just a year off, I shouted, the coffee cup rattling on the granite. It's my scholarship, it's my career track, it's the time I spent working. That money wasn't a loan, it was mine. What exactly did you do with it? My father let out a harsh, wary sigh. He picked up a glossy invitation mock-up, studied it, and then, without looking at me, delivered the blow that cracked my foundation. We didn't just borrow it, Son dotted. We wired it directly to the Italian vineyard deposit. We needed it to happen now. So you took it, I whispered, the rage draining out, replaced by a terrifying hollow calm. You emptied my account without my permission, after I explicitly told you what the consequences would be. He looked up then, meeting my eyes with a chilling lack of apology, his lips curled into a half-smirk, a gesture of parental authority mixed with callous indifference. Yes, we did, he said flatly. And then, he leaned back, the words cutting through the kitchen like shards of broken glass. And frankly, we'd do it again. Family helps family, and right now, Charlotte is our priority. You're smart. You can figure it out. My sister let out a triumphant little laugh, a sound that was pure mockery. My mother, relieved the confrontation was over, chuckled, and said, "Now, can we please get back to the table settings? This is tedious." That was the moment the emotional realization hit me. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about a mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated betrayal, and the cruelest part was their absolute conviction that they were justified, their expectation that I would simply absorb the damage. They didn't love me less. They simply valued me last. The promise of loyalty, the very concept of a family first, had been a lie used exclusively against me. I looked at the three of them, the father who had stolen my future, the mother who enabled it, and the sister who reveled in it, and felt the agonizing warmth of pain transform into something cold, hard, and utterly irreversible. The dread was gone. The hope was extinguished. I took a deep, steadying breath. I picked up the tuition statement and, without another word, walked out the front door, leaving the suffocating smell of budget frosting and casual cruelty behind. My parents' casual laughter followed me onto the porch. I was alone, bankrupt, and my career was on hold. But walking away, I felt an icy clarity. They had taught me the definition of loyalty. Now, I would teach them the definition of consequence. The protagonist realizes the family's actions were not a desperate request for a loan, but a deliberate, justified theft, and that they hold no love or respect, only contempt. The immediate, agonizing pain is replaced by an unnerving, cold determination for retaliation. The silence of my rented studio apartment was deafening, a stark contrast to the mocking laughter I'd left ringing in the affluent kitchen of my childhood home. The initial volcanic rage from the confrontation, the betrayal, the theft, the cruel justification, had settled into a cold, dense residue. It was a clarity born of absolute disillusionment. They hadn't just stolen money, they had willingly, casually dismantled my immediate future to fund a picturesque lie for my sister. The next morning was a blur of frantic action. The year 25,000 was gone, but the tuition bill remained, now marked with a menacing final notice CE. My competitive engineering program, the one I'd poured 4 years of my life into, had a strict drop-date policy for non-payment. Failed to pay by the end of the week, and the entire semester was void. The scholarship, the banked credits, the momentum, all forfeited. I spent 72 hours in a state of hyper-focused crisis. Sleep was impossible. My old laptop glowed on the kitchen counter, displaying a sickening tapestry of red-inked university warnings and confusing loan options. My savings account was an abyss. I couldn't call the bank or the university and say, "My parents stole the money to pay for my sister's Tuscany wedding." That was a family melodrama, not a viable financial excuse. I liquidated everything I could, the small amount of stock I held, a prized vintage vinyl collection, even my reliable old desktop computer. Anything that wasn't strictly necessary for survival. The combined proceeds only clawed back about a 3,000. It was a drop in a very empty bucket. The only way out was maximum leverage. I applied for every emergency loan, private debt option, and high-interest credit card I could find. The interest rates were terrifying, predatory beasts that would haunt me for years. But the alternative, dropping out, losing the scholarship, and watching my career vaporize, was worse. I signed the papers, my hand steady, accepting the crushing burden of debt. The weight settled on my shoulders instantly, a tangible, suffocating cloak. I secured just enough to keep my enrollment active, but this wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a profound emotional shift. The money I was now paying was my own debt, incurred because of their choice. Every interest payment would be a physical reminder of their betrayal. I had bought my freedom from their control at an astronomical price. During this stressful week, the family, oblivious to the catastrophe they had manufactured, continued their wedding planning. My phone, which I had sworn to ignore, vibrated relentlessly. The messages weren't apologies or offers of help, they were logistical demands. From Charlotte, just confirming you're still good to pick up the specialty cake toppers from the city this weekend. You're driving, right? Ours is busy. From Eleanor, don't be cross, sweetheart. Your father and I are busy with a really big, exciting project. We need to focus on this new investment. You'll understand when you're older. Hope you sorted out that college thing. The new investment caught my attention. I knew my father, Richard, had been talking for months about leaving his secured, if dull, manufacturing job to go into business with a longtime acquaintance named Gary. It was a massive leap of faith, one my mother had repeatedly called their financial redemption. A cold, methodical idea began to form in the corner of my mind. Pushing aside the raw hurt, they had played a zero-sum game with my life, now I would play one with theirs. If they were looking for redemption, I would ensure they received a different kind of reckoning. I used my remaining spare time that should have been dedicated to advanced engineering coursework, to research. I didn't search for jobs, I searched for weaknesses. I found out the following crucial details: the investment. Richard and Eleanor were taking out a significant second mortgage on the family home. The very house where I was laughed at, to become silent, majority investors in Gary's nascent tech startup, InnovateFlow. The amount was astronomical, far greater than my Ye-Thou's 25,000 fund. The flaw: Gary, the founder, had a history of aggressive, risky business dealings that had teetered on the edge of legality. Public records were sparse, but a deep dive into old industry blogs revealed a pattern of over-promising, under-delivering, and burning investor money. The house, most crucially. I dug up old property records. 5 years ago, when I turned 18, my parents had asked me to sign a vague set of documents related to tax and estate planning. They had dismissed my questions with the usual, "Just sign it, it's boring paperwork." My meticulous research confirmed that among those documents was a complex, nearly forgotten agreement that, in exchange for signing a previous refinance, I held a minor, silent ownership stake in the deed, only to be activated under specific, extreme financial distress, namely, a second mortgage default. The discovery was a surge of adrenaline, a jolt of empowerment in the face of my debt. The parents who had just stolen my future had, years ago, unknowingly signed a document that gave me a long, dormant weapon aimed squarely at their current financial life raft. They were so focused on their new, grand venture and Charlotte's wedding that they hadn't covered their own backs. This was no longer about getting my thousand back. That money was spent. This was about justice for the lie, the betrayal, and the crushing debt they forced upon me. They wanted to play high-stakes business. Fine, they were betting their house on a risky venture, and I had a hidden card, a right to step in and influence the outcome the moment they stumbled. The stage was set. The discarded child, was in crippling debt. They, the family first parents, were leveraged to the absolute limit, ready to bet their entire security on a collapsing hand. I quietly printed the decades-old deed transfer document and filed it away. The long game begins. The summer wedding was a spectacle of obscene wealth and forced perfection. It was everything the stolen the 25,000 had bought: Tuscan wine, hand-stitched lace, and a guest list packed with wealthy relatives and influential business contacts. I attended, not as a celebration of family, but as a strategic observer. I wore the crushing weight of my new debt like invisible armor, watching my parents and sister bask in their manufactured triumph. My parents were radiant, puffed up with pride and the confident swagger of new entrepreneurs. They spoke constantly about InnovateFlow, their major investment with Gary, as if it were already a Fortune 500 company. "The returns are going to be astronomical," my father, Richard, declared to a group of guests sipping champagne. "We're talking about selling the business in a few years for a huge profit. We'll be set for life." My mother, Eleanor, beamed, nudging me playfully. "See, darling. We told you it would work out. We had to prioritize the big picture." The big picture. I merely smiled, a cold, practiced gesture, and nodded. I was no longer a participant in their family drama. I was the audience, waiting for the third act tragedy. The collapse of Innovate Flow was swift, brutal, and entirely predictable. Gary's history repeated itself. Within 3 months of the wedding, the money, including the substantial amount from my parents' second mortgage, vanished into opaque development costs. The technology failed to materialize. Regulatory problems surfaced, and the whole venture was exposed as nothing more than a highly leveraged, poorly executed pipe dream. The shift in my parents was painful to watch, even for me. The confidence drained away, replaced by an increasingly desperate anxiety. They began calling me, not out of care, but out of financial panic. My name. Listen. Richard hissed into the phone one Tuesday evening, his voice ragged. The payments on the second mortgage are due. We need to service the debt until we can figure out how to sell the house quickly. Could you just put a few thousand on your credit cards? Just to float us. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The expectation of obedience, even after total betrayal, was still their default setting. No, I said, my voice quiet, flat, and entirely devoid of emotion. There was a stunned silence on the line. What do you mean, no? I mean, I can't, I clarified. I'm servicing my own high-interest debt that I had to take on to stay in college after my fund was emptied. I can't spare a cent. You ungrateful child! Eleanor screamed, snatching the phone. We are facing ruin. Our house is on the line. This is family. Where is your loyalty? My loyalty. I echoed, the phrase tasting like ash. You asked me that same question when you stole my future to pay for Charlotte's seating chart. You remember what you said? You laughed. You smirked and said, we'd do it again. I paused, letting the silence burn between us. You taught me a lesson that day. I continued, my voice gaining a clinical edge. The lesson was survival is solitary, and emotional attachment is weakness. I have adopted your lesson. I am focused on my survival, and I have no money left for yours. You are going to let us lose everything over a petty grudge. Richard yelled, desperation making his voice crack. No. I countered. You lost everything when you willingly placed a bet you couldn't cover. My $25,000 was a sacrifice you deemed necessary for a wedding. Your house is a sacrifice you deemed necessary for a pipe dream. You prioritized short-term, selfish desires over long-term security. I am simply allowing the natural consequence of those choices to play out. The line went silent again. This silence was different. It was the profound shock of realization. They finally understood that I was not the victim they could bully, but an adversary they had created. The full confrontation is over. The protagonist, having absorbed their parents' cruelty and cynicism, now weaponizes those very traits against them. The parents realize, with terrifying clarity, that the person they mocked and dismissed is now the one holding the line, refusing to save them, and watching their downfall with cold, intellectual satisfaction. The raw anger is gone, only the icy determination of the long game remains. The calls stopped immediately after our final conversation. My parents understood that the emotional blackmail had failed. They were facing foreclosure, and the person they had most wronged was now their unmoving executioner. The silence was heavy, broken only by the automated, guilt-inducing emails from my mother Eleanor, forwarding property tax statements and veiled hints about how much they loved that house. I kept my head down, focusing on my engineering program. The debt was a constant phantom, but the knowledge that I was moving forward while they were imploding provided a perverse kind of motivation. The foreclosure process was slow, bureaucratic, and public. Because of the size of the second mortgage they had taken to fund Innovate Flow, the house was quickly listed for auction by the bank. The date was set for a chilly Saturday morning in early winter. During this period, I made a critical move using the research I had conducted months earlier. I called the lawyer who had handled the 18th birthday, tax and estate planning papers. I didn't mention the betrayal or the wedding. I spoke only in dry legal terms about the minor, silent ownership stake I held in the deed, contingent upon a second mortgage default. The lawyer confirmed the clause was obscure but valid. I was not a primary owner, but I had a legal right to be informed, to challenge the sale parameters, and most importantly, to participate in the auction with unique advantages due to my documented interest in the property. My claim was small, but it was enough to make me a legitimate bidder and give me leverage for better terms with the bank. I secured a substantial line of credit, enough to make a serious bid using the highly anticipated post-graduation job offer I had recently secured as collateral. The irony was sharp. The career they had tried to destroy was now funding their final humiliation. As the auction day approached, I received a frantic text from Charlotte. She hadn't been informed of the severity of their finances, believing the issue was a temporary cash flow problem. From Charlotte. The moving trucks are here. They're really moving Mom and Dad's things into a rental apartment. They said it's temporary, but I saw the notice. Is this real? You have to help them. You're the only one with a good job right now. You can't let them lose the house we grew up in. The house we grew up in. She finally cared because her own security was vaguely threatened by the instability. My reply. They chose a Tuscany vineyard over my college. I chose my future over their house. Ask them why they risked everything on a fraudulent business instead of paying their debts. The consequences are theirs alone. This is not my fight. I received no reply. The communication wall was solid. The night before the auction, I drove past the house for the first time since the wedding. The windows were dark, the garage door sealed. It looked empty and defeated, a monument to greed and favoritism. I parked down the street and sat in my car, staring at the front door where I had been dismissed with a cold smirk. I wasn't feeling anger now, or even satisfaction, but a profound sense of closure. The old, hopeful me, the one who wanted their approval and believed their lies, had died right there on that doorstep. I was ready. The debt was mine, but the opportunity for justice was also mine. I had done the work, taken the risk, and studied the law. Tomorrow was the culmination of their betrayal and the birth of my ultimate empowerment. Rising tension discovery. The legal setup is complete. The protagonist secures the financing to bid on the house and receives the final, desperate plea from the sister, confirming the depth of the fallout. The stage is set for the final, public confrontation at the auction. The foreclosure auction was held in the drafty, sterile lobby of the county courthouse. It was poorly attended, a small, grim collection of investors and speculators looking for distressed deals. I arrived precisely 5 minutes before the bidding started, dressed in the dark, immaculate suit I'd worn to my job interviews, carrying a heavy briefcase that contained my legal documents and cashier's check. Then I saw them. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, stood huddled in a corner, looking utterly defeated. They were pale, their expensive winter coats looking cheap and frayed against their drawn faces. They weren't there to bid, they were there to witness the final, crushing moment of their failure. They spotted me instantly. Their expressions shifted from despair to a desperate, last-minute plea for rescue. "My name, thank God," Eleanor whispered, rushing toward me, reaching out a hand. "You're here, you came to save us, didn't you? You can buy it back for us, put it in your name." I didn't flinch. I let her hand drop harmlessly, my eyes holding a steady, unforgiving gaze. "I'm here to bid," I stated, simply stepping past her toward the auction official. Richard followed, his voice hoarse. "Listen, son, daughter, we're sorry about the college fund, okay? We made a mistake. Please, just save the house. We have nowhere to go." The official started the proceedings. The bidding was slow at first, then accelerated rapidly as the investors realized the value of the property. I waited. When the bidding stalled near its peak, a figure far exceeding the stolen at 25,000, I raised my hand. "1,000 over the current bid," I said clearly. The room paused. My parents gasped. The investors looked at me, a young, unexpected bidder. One tried to push higher, but I countered immediately, raising the amount again, putting in the final bid that stunned the small crowd into silence. The official's hammer hung in the air. "Sold," the official announced, pointing directly at me. Eleanor let out a choked sob. Richard staggered back against the wall. I walked up to the official, presenting my documents. As I signed the papers, formally transferring the property, my parents approached, their faces streaked with tears, hope still flickering in their eyes. "Thank you," Richard whispered, pulling me into a desperate, clinging hug that I did not return. "We'll repay you. We'll figure out a way to pay the rent." I pulled back from his grasp. I looked them both directly in the eye, seeing the raw, terrified vulnerability that lay beneath their years of arrogant entitlement. "I didn't buy this house for you," I said, my voice low but carrying the weight of finality. "I bought this house for me." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out 2 documents. The first was the original deed for the house, now solely in my name. The second was a pre-signed, legally binding agreement with a property developer I had been negotiating with for months, contingent on me acquiring the property. The market shifted. It turns out the land is more valuable than we thought, I explained, holding up the second document. I just closed the sale of this property for $150,000 profit. The paperwork is finalized. Their eyes went wide, reflecting the horror of the realization. You sold it, Eleanor stammered. Yes, an hour ago, I confirmed. I used the funds I secured with my new, unjeopardized career, and I leveraged the opportunity your failure created. You laughed at me for losing $25,000. I just made 6 times that amount off your ruin. I handed them a single, sealed envelope. They opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was a cashier's check made out to them for precisely $20,000 with a memo line. RPR ZR Terresto. I then produced a crisp, single sheet of paper and placed it on top of the check. It was a certified letter from my lawyer. The house is gone. The profit is mine, I finished. That check repays the principal you stole. Now, read the memo from my attorney. Richard squinted at the paper. It was a cease and desist letter explicitly outlining the termination of all contact and detailing that any attempt to contact me, Charlotte, or interfere with my life would be met with swift legal action. You taught me to prioritize my own security. You taught me that family is a liability to be cut off when inconvenient, I stated, placing my hand on the briefcase. I took your lesson, applied it to your lives, and generated a profitable return. Consider this the interest on your cruelty. I turned away from their stunned, silent faces and walked out of the courthouse, leaving the $150,000 in check. Their clean conscience money, on the table, a final deliberate act of absolute emotional detachment. The debt was settled. My future was secure. The story is complete, with the protagonist empowered and the family served with the ultimate consequence.